I guess that's what I wanted to do. All righty then. So, hi everybody, and thanks again, Susan, for that nice introduction. Get out of the training box, and I'm really happy to be here. One of the things I would just added this slide this morning, because I love ISPI. I discovered it. I read Tom Gilbert's Human Competence book in about 1982, and I got directed toward ISPI, and I became a member early in the 80s, and first through the Massachusetts chapter, where I was president for a couple of years, and then got pretty involved nationally. And I love the organization. It hit some hard times a few years ago, but I'm really happy to say I was at the annual conference a few weeks ago in Virginia, and it wasn't giant, but it was like 300 people. And I think it's hit bottom and starting to grow again. And I'm really excited about that, because although all of the pioneers and thought leaders that I originally learned from are no longer with us, it's a vibrant community. It's a group of people who really want to learn and want to help other people perform. It doesn't feel like a trade show. It doesn't feel like we're going to market the heck out of everything. It feels like a learning organization. And so I love ISPI. And also, I presented like lifetimes ago at the Minnesota chapter, and I don't remember when it was, but it was quite a few years. So it's really nice to be back. And as Susan said, this white paper that we actually wrote quite a few years ago and then updated a little bit, you can get it in the chat box. You can find it on our website, actually, at performancethinking.com or sixboxes.com if you go to the resource library. It's not a big deal, but it covers a lot of the same ground that we're going to talk about today, although I think I've updated a little bit how I think about this since then. So here's an agenda, and it's kind of a long one, but I want to start out with a story that I heard about a year ago that I think is a horror story about being stuck in the training box. And then I want to tell you a little bit about what I mean by that, and I doubt if there's anybody here who is unfamiliar with the training as order taker problem, so to speak. But it's kind of like that. That's what we're talking about. And then, of course, people talk about performance consulting, whatever that might mean to them. And sometimes it seems to mean just kind of training on steroids, where you have training professionals who can talk more like business people. And to me, that's not really what performance consulting is. To me, performance consulting is looking at the system in which people perform and optimizing that. And so then I want to shift a little bit. And I actually will be using the HPT model that Susan shared a little bit as one of the examples of complexity. But I want to talk about kind of the journey that I've been on for 20 some years, probably 30 years, to make performance improvement accessible to more people. Because those of us who are here, we're probably kind of performance improvement nerds. We like this stuff. We are into it. We want to know about it. But frankly, our stakeholders and our clients, they just want to have some, improve some performance. And so what I've learned is, and I'll take you through this process where what we now call performance thinking has become a plain English, simple framework that makes it easier to communicate with folks. And that's part of the solution that we suggest for getting out of the training box. And then I want to talk about what I think of as the two elements of, quote, getting out of the training box. One is learning how to do performance consulting ourselves, which is challenging to some extent. Everybody here probably knows that, but which is doable. The other part, which is harder, in my opinion, is engaging with stakeholders in a way that they will accept, that they don't hold us in our box. And so I want to talk a little bit about the partnering thing. And then sprinkled throughout here, there's going to be some suggestions or recommendations and such. And then we'll have time to talk, which I'm really excited, by the way. This is an hour and a half, because I don't think we're going to take all that time, but it means that I don't have to be breathless. We can actually have it's a nice amount of time to talk. So the horror story, and you don't really have to read this, but I was working with a client a couple of years ago, a large health insurance company, and I'd actually worked with the primary stakeholder there at two previous companies where they had actually been acquired and then became part of this larger organization. But between the time that I'd worked with them before and a year and a half ago, the parent company had put a very large number of their training and development folks through what was called a performance consulting certification program offered by a company that I will not name because I don't want to say bad things about them. But what was very interesting, and I honestly couldn't believe this, and I checked it out a couple times and confirmed that what these people were taught, or at least what they learned, was that if their performance analysis revealed the need for some so-called non-training intervention, then they should decline the opportunity, that they should back off from it. And what that means is that they routinely were refusing projects that did not involve training. And ultimately, this kind of created separation and friction. It didn't create engagement and partnering. And I couldn't understand what was going on in the company, frankly, until I discovered this piece of information, because what I learned was that a lot of the training and development people I was speaking with, who I was certifying in our performance thinking, performance consulting methodology, were kind of hesitant to go, do anything but training. Whereas historically, I'd always had our colleagues talking about how frustrated they were about not being allowed to do things more than skills and knowledge. So what I would propose is that the right solution would be to teach them how to partner with stakeholders, how to optimize return on investment, not to withdraw. So I still can't believe this example when I talk about it, but it was a real thing. And to me, it was almost like a caricature of the problem we encounter already sometimes when we try to help our stakeholders. Now, some of you may be familiar with our 6 boxes model, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the history of it. But if you think about this, which is really a descendant of Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, the non-training solutions are in those other 5 cells. They're setting expectations and feedback. They're providing tools and resources. They're arranging for consequences and incentives and eliminating unintended negative ones. They're putting people in the right jobs. They're engaging people about what their values and motives and preferences are to be sure everything is aligned. So if that is the non-training solutions, then it's not a surprise. If we as performance professionals push back on anybody who wants non-training solutions, which is what the horror story was about, or if our clients won't let us engage in these other areas or partner with them, then it's not a surprise that training has a kind of a reputation for not very big return on investment. So it's, when you look at it this way, it's kind of a very interesting thing. So that sort of sets this up a little bit, because what I'd like to talk about, first of all, is what do I mean by the training box? And I think there's a lot of ways to think about it. I love this picture, I have to say. But first of all, it's the assumption that there's a need for skills and knowledge. Now, that's not probably what we all do, what probably most of the people who are in this discussion or this group are about. But we know very well that our clients, our stakeholders often say, we got a performance issue, could you please come and train them? And I, of course, get all cranked up about this. I remember when George Floyd was murdered a few years ago, and this is, I suppose, a sensitive topic in this audience, but I remember for the umpteenth time seeing on television mayors and chiefs of police, not just in that case, but in a lot of cases, getting up and saying, well, we're going to retrain our police force, as though that was actually going to change this behavior. And I got so cranked up about it that I actually submitted an op-ed to the New York Times, which of course was never published. But there is this assumption that somehow training is the big lever. And we all know that it very often is not only not needed, but if you just do it, you're probably not going to get the return on investment you need. And so the training box is also ignoring the other behavior influences, those non-training interventions. It's by definition then lacking a systemic approach. Because if there's one thing we know, just if we stand back and sort of take off our professional hats and just think about what it means to work in some environment, there's a whole lot of stuff that affects how productive we are and how engaged we are that are part of a larger system that's not just about skills and knowledge. So by definition, being stuck in the training box is not taking a systemic approach. And bottom line is, it's failing to optimize return on investment. It's going in with a crippled already, because we can only pull one lever. So that's what I mean by the training box. Now, if you contrast that to at least what I think performance consulting means, what I learned from a lot of the masters and thought leaders in this world, first of all, the purpose is to accelerate results through the performance of people. That seems to me to be the point of performance improvement or performance consulting. And it's got to be more than training on steroids. I mean, I'm a little bit cynical in that one. In that phrase, you can perhaps catch my drift on it. But there are actually books out there and other things out there about performance consulting that appear to me to be directed toward learning and development people. And it's mostly saying that they need to be able to speak more with greater business acumen. Not that they need to necessarily get outside the training box, but at least they need to line up their training with the business needs and sort of vocabulary of their stakeholders. I think we got to be doing more than that if we're going to actually have an effect. We need to partner with our stakeholders. We need to engage them since they ultimately have more influence than we do. Pardon me, by the way, I may cough a few times. I'm having really nasty seasonal allergies and it's turned into a little bit of a cough. So bottom line is, ideally partnering with our stakeholders, we need to configure and align all those things that influence behavior so we can optimize return on investment. And I always say that the whole point is two things. It's not just productivity, because if we wanted productivity, we might have slaves that we didn't pay anything and whip them. But what we want is, in fact, people who are productive, but also engaged and happy to be here and feeling good about it. So to me, that's what performance consulting or performance improvement can accomplish. Now, I had the benefit of knowing all of these people. And when I look at them, I guess all of them are no longer with us. But these are the giants in the ISPI world. These are the people, and there's others not here, but these are all people that I personally knew, who were mentors to me, who were incredibly generous with what they were willing to teach and share. And that's really what ISPI is about. I mean, these were some of the kind of founding folks in the field of performance improvement. And these people were powerful in terms of their impact, and they were also very generous, every single one of them. But many of the models that they produced were kind of complicated. And in fact, I recall, because I've been, as I've mentioned early on, in ISPI for a long time. And I remember when I first got involved, probably for the first decade in the 80s and early 90s, that you would go to meetings, or occasionally I would get invited to these kind of thought leader meetings. I was kind of a junior member of this group of people. And I would watch those great thought leaders argue over their models. And at some point, ISPI decided, we don't want any more like arguing over models. So let's just go for standards and principles and stuff, which is kind of where ISPI is now. But the fact is, these people all had their versions of what it looks like. And so this is just a few of them. These are actually from a single article that was published in, I think, 1993 about HPT or performance improvement models. And there's a bunch more of them, and the thing is, they're all good. There's nothing wrong with any of these. They have, interesting stuff in them. You look at them, you say, well, they've organized things in different ways. And of course, this is a version of what Susan shared with us earlier. And it's good. And I sometimes half jokingly refer to it as the everything, including the kitchen sink model, because it has a lot in it. And I remember early on when I was first not only doing consulting projects, but beginning to develop performance consultants in some of my client organizations in the early 90s, and actually in the 80s even. And I would go into some departments, and they might even have this on the wall. And they'd be saying stuff like, I've been trying to do that, but, ultimately, people say it's complicated. Or if our clients come through here, stakeholders, VP of whatever it is, they say, wait a minute, how long is this going to take? Is this analysis paralysis? Like, what's going on? And so there was a certain amount of pushback, and not only from our stakeholders, who weren't inherently performance improvement nerds, but also from some of our colleagues who were trying to come up through into the field and learn stuff. They're saying, man, this is really complicated. So I sort of got a bug in my ear, how you want to call it, to try to simplify. And I was fortunate because even though I never knew Steve Jobs, I was very, very much influenced by him early on. One of the pictures that I showed you earlier on of the thought leaders was a man named Ogden Lindsley, who was a friend and mentor to me for 30 years. And he was one of the many Gilbert Award winners. I think just about everybody on that list of pictures I showed you won the Thomas F. Gilbert Award at some point. And Ogden he was actually one of Skinner's most important students. And then he developed a whole field called precision teaching, which I was deeply involved in. But anyway, Ogden was an early adopter of the Apple II computer in the late 70s. And he was a university professor. He used to teach his students very early on how to program the Apple II. But he was proud because he had something like number 305 Apple II computer. And then, of course, later the Macintosh came. But he turned me on to Apple because if you think about the Apple II in particular, it was prior to the Apple II, there were big, hairy, complicated IBM or mini computers, or there were hobbyist computers that were all kind of wired together and soldered pieces and stuff. And what Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak did was take the components of such a thing, create a box or a set of boxes that, a person could be at home in their kitchen looking at recipes on it to make it simple and accessible so that the technology did not get in the way. And of course, then when the Macintosh came out, it was billed as the computer for the rest of us because you could sit down and pretty much start to use it with this graphic user interface. And so I got turned on to Apple and actually Steve Jobs early in the late 70s, early 80s. And I became kind of a fanboy, and I have way more Apple products than anybody should admit to. But this whole notion of simplicity was important. And I encountered a book that you might find interesting by a fellow named Ken Segall, who worked with Steve Jobs at both Apple Computer and Next Computer. And the book is about how Steve Jobs basically took the value of the principle of simplicity into everything in his company. So, for example, meetings should have no more people than are absolutely required. The way the place was organized. When Jobs came back to Apple Computer after he'd left for a few years, he took a long product list and simplified it to 4 products. That's 4, Carl. But anyway, when I was reading that book, I found this paragraph, and I thought it was very compelling because I kind of related to it from a performance improvement perspective. He said, when you start looking at a problem and it seems really simple with all these simple solutions, you don't really understand the complexity of the problem, which is a little bit like performance. And then you get into the problem and you see it's really complicated and you come up with all these convoluted solutions. And that's sort of the middle. And it's where most people stop and the solutions tend to work for a while. But you can keep on going and find the key underlying principle of the problem and come up with a beautiful, elegant solution that works. Now, I'm no Steve Jobs. I don't claim to be Steve Jobs. But when I read this, it struck me as describing a process that I and my colleagues had gone through over about 15 years to try to simplify. And so I would like to try to lay that out for you, because from my perspective, the simplification, not making things simplistic, but making them simple and easy to understand, is a big step toward getting out of the training box. By the way, also, if you're interested, I did a talk on this, invited talk at the Association of Behavior Analysis a few years ago called Simple is Better, that drills into this a lot more. And if you can find it on our YouTube channel, or you can point your phone at this QR code and find it. But anyway, what I'm going to unpack for you is performance thinking, in which we say we have 2 simple visual models and 21 plain English words. And with those, we can teach people and enable people to, first of all, analyze and improve performance. Secondly, communicate across the usual silos and levels where everybody has their different vocabulary and different technical details. And by sharing that, we can build communities of practice, which we've seen happen in a lot of organizations between managers and leaders, as well as performance professionals. And we can drive collaboration for continuous improvement. And we can do what performance consulting is supposed to do, which is accelerate results through people. And some years ago, we were beginning to sort of develop this in the early 2000s, and we were beginning to teach our clients how to do it this way. And they said to me, a lot of them said to me, you know, you're giving us some tools and approach, but what you're really doing is teaching us to think differently about performance. You're giving us a framework to look at that's simple. So we started using that phrase, and then, as you will see, we trademarked it and named our company after it. But I want to unpack performance thinking for you a little bit. And what I would say is that for anybody, performance professionals, learning and development folks, leaders, managers, coaches, supervisors, you name it, anybody who's really trying to improve or develop performance needs to have kind of crisp answers to these three questions. And they may seem fairly obvious to you, but I think they're worth stating. First is, what is human performance? And if we were in a room and we were, did a flip chart exercise and so forth, and I asked people that, people would say a lot of good things. They would say, well, it's behavior producing results, or it's achieving the company's, strategic goals, or it's enabling people to produce accomplishments, or it's, there'd be all these things, and they would pretty much all be true. But the problem with that is, if you're going to analyze performance, we want to have what behavior scientists would call units of analysis. We want to have a crisp way to look at a hunk of performance and dissect it into its elements. And we want to be able to define what those elements are. And so I'll show you, we have a model called the performance chain, which will be very familiar to you, whether you've seen it or not, to the extent that you know about accomplishment-based performance improvement. Okay, so we got that. So then the next question is, what influences human performance? And the quick answer to that is, it's a list that goes from here to, Chicago or whatever, because there's so many things. Depends what book you read, depends what latest seminars, all these different things, mindset, you name it, right? And so that's kind of complicated. We need some framework for understanding that. And then let's say we've got answers to those first two questions. Now, what do we do with that? And so I want to show you how we've approached this. First of all, what is human performance? Well, for me, it starts with Tom Gilbert, because I got introduced to Tom's book actually about 1980 or 81, and then I read it, and I sort of understood it, but then it wasn't until a couple of years later, when I was president of the Massachusetts ISPI chapter, and I invited Tom and Marilyn Gilbert to come and do a workshop, and I really got to know them, and I started to understand the implications of it. And then I met Joe Harless, who was his protege, and really got it. But this was an enormous paradigm shift. And in my view, this focus on what he called valuable accomplishments was what really created the field of performance improvement. And what he said was, and you probably are familiar with this, but if you're not, I'm going to read it anyway, whatever. In the great cult of behavior, he said, and he didn't mean behaviorists, he meant everybody that's trying to lead, manage, train, develop people. What he said is, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to it. We're always trying to change behavior. But he said, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. And so what he was doing is shifting the focus from let's look at this behavior to let's look at the valuable contributions or products or accomplishments. Now, this made an enormous impact, and it changed the world in many ways. It's what I think led from ISPI originally being the National Society for Programmed Instruction, which was about instructional systems, to being the National Society for Performance and Instruction, to being the International Society for Performance Improvement. It really led the charge toward performance improvement. And the challenge with it, though, is I love the word accomplishments because it sounds good, it sounds valuable, and so forth. But first of all, if you look up that word, in the dictionary, you will see there are more definitions of it that mean the completion of behavior than the products of behavior. And secondly, if you look at our literature, if you go to ISPI conferences, if you read the journals, you will see this word used in a pretty broad variety of ways, all the way from big sort of business result type things down to deliverables and everything in between. So when I looked at this years ago, I said, this is complicated. This is like fuzzy. We need a clear definition. And so we coined the phrase work outputs, probably influenced by Gary Rumler to some extent, and some others. But there's two reasons for this phrase. One is work. It might be play, but it's behavior in any case. So it's clearly the product of activity. And secondly, notice that outputs is plural. And if there's a single thing that I think I've stipulated in the work that we do over the last 30 years, that's maybe more explicit than for some people, is that an accomplishment has to be countable. And we say it has to be a countable noun. It has to be a thing, which you can actually say, that's a good one, that's not such a good one. So Tom set the stage. And the performance chain is our model that describes how behavior produces organizational or business results. And what it says is, there's behavior influences, and then there are the three elements, if you will, of performance. If you start with the end in mind, there's organizational or business results. They're the things that are indicators of the success of the whole entity. Now, if we take into account, a societal view, we can talk about societal results. But the point is, they're the things that reflect the success or the health of the whole thing. And so in the case of an organization, it would typically be what's on the dashboard of the C-level executives. What do investors look at? How do we judge the health of this organization? We always want to know what's at stake for that, in that category. Once we do, we can then look at performance and we can say, what are the work outputs? What are the accomplishments? And there's a lot of different kinds, but they're all countable things that people contribute, either teams, individuals, processes contribute toward organizational results. And once we know that, we can look at the behavior. So those are the elements, as we define them, of performance. And they come back to, in many ways, Tom's formula. The subtitle of his book, Human Competence, was Engineering Worthy Performance. And he had this equation where he said the worth of any given intervention, and of course he used the word accomplishments, but I put work outputs in there. He said the worth of an intervention is equal to the value of the work outputs that it enables people to produce or increase, divided by the cost of behavior. Now, once you see that, you say, that's kind of obvious, isn't it? You ever been in a training program that cost a lot of time and money, and at the end of it, you say, will this enable people to produce anything of value? I bet you have. Or, maybe we could have used a job aid, and maybe it would have made the cost of behavior a little less expensive, et cetera. So this is a cool formula, and I don't encourage people to use it in a kind of a spreadsheety mathematical way. But of course, the modern term for this is return on investment. What we're saying is, if you're going to improve performance, let's be sure that it actually achieves improvement of accomplishments or work outputs at a cost that is less than that. And so this leads us to think about optimizing the cost, essentially. So what I would say is, just to summarize about return on investment, is that it's about, let's identify and maximize the value of the work outputs, and then let's optimize the cost of enabling the behavior. Simple enough. And going back to that horror story, if you're just pulling the skills and knowledge lever, you're probably not going to be able to optimize the cost to produce the behavior, because you're going to be putting an awful lot of weight on the shoulders of that training program without necessarily engaging supervisors, managers, leaders to do their part. So we focus on work outputs. When we're looking at accomplishments, when we look at performance, we start out with the work outputs or accomplishments. That's what we anchor stuff to, because once we know that, we can generally look credibly and see how they contribute to organizational results and what behavior produces them. Now, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this because we could go on, but the words that are below work outputs on this model are not really a taxonomy. That is, they're not mutually exclusive categories. But what we've learned is that if you say that a work output is a thing, it's a countable thing that people or processes or teams produce, then there's a lot of kinds, and people often focus just on a few of them. Like, we all know about deliverables, widgets or documents. But transactions like a loan or a sale are an output or an accomplishment. Decisions are some of the most valuable ones we make, especially for managers, leaders, or coaches. A decision is the product of a bunch of activity, and then we decide to buy this or invest in this or fund this or hire this person. Milestones is just a word that we use to define outputs inside of a process. Relationships might sound kind of funny to call accomplishments, but let's face it, we work really hard to establish and maintain good working relationships, and we can define good ones. It's funny because on our YouTube channel, We've done, I think, 31 webinars now. And I think the second or third one was about relationships as valuable accomplishments. And I think it's still the most watched, because it kind of is like, what do you mean? That sounds kind of nerdy. But actually, we can talk about good relationships. And then changes or innovations, those are things that what we would look for: new ideas, prototypes, improved processes. Products of communication is a tricky one, because when you try to get people to analyze performance, some of them will fight you to the death and say that phone calls and meetings and presentations are outputs. And I'll say, no, they're not. They're activity. What do you get at the end of the phone call? Oh, an appointment, a decision, a new friend. You know, what do you get? Have you ever been in a meeting that didn't produce anything of value? I have. Most of us have. So we use this phrase, products of communication, so that when people look at these activities, like training, presentations, phone calls, etc., instead of saying, oh, that's the output, we'll say, no, what does it produce? That's the valuable part. And then solutions, answers, people who produce. As a training professional, I want to produce people who can now do the thing, whatever it is, or produce the thing. Or, for example, as a customer service representative, I would like to produce people who at the end of the call say, yeah, thank you, you solved my problem, etc. So I just mentioned that because when you're really defining work outputs, it's the hard part of this work, and those are a lot of different kinds. Now, here's an example, simple example of what we call an individual performance map, very simple example of the outputs of a role, a sales director. Sales director delivers value to those three different customers: the sales account manager, the customer service team, VP of sales, and those are his or her work outputs. Here's another slightly more complicated one. This is a chief learning officer, and you can see that the chief learning officer focused on digital transformation. This is a particular person who was working in a bank. They have to produce all these things, and if you look around at those things, they're all countable nouns. They're plans, decisions, visions, statements, relationships, etc. So we can define the outputs of individuals, and we teach people to do that. And then we can take processes. It's a simple example. Most people, there's probably a lot of people in this group, I bet, who've done process work. And typically process mapping is a series of activities, right? Behavior. But we like to focus on the outputs. We want to know what each of those things produced of added value. And not everybody does that. In fact, I used to be intimidated by sort of sophisticated process people, and because they have a lot of tools, a lot of data and all that, and certifications and you name it. But I've now worked with some very sophisticated process people in a biotech firm and an insurance company and other companies. And what I've learned is that we as performance improvement professionals can add two important things. One is to be sure that we identify the work outputs or the valuable outputs of each step in a process, because it makes it easier to diagnose, it makes it easier to measure. There's a bunch of things that make that better. And secondly, instead of just throwing mistakes or errors or defects into the human error bucket, we can use something like the 6 boxes model to actually analyze in detail why the performance happened in that way that was defective in a way that we can improve. So anyway, we can look at work outputs in a process. So that's what we say performance is. What is performance? It's behavior that produces. Well, this is B.F. Skinner.
Dr. Binder,
yes.
Can you just repeat what you just said? Your audio cut out.
I'm sorry, about this?
Yeah, what you were just summarizing.
What I was saying was, the first question, if you remember, that I was saying we need to be able to address is, what is performance? And our answer to that is the performance chain, which is behavior that produces work outputs that contribute to organizational results or business results. So then the second question is, what influences human performance? And this starts with B.F. Skinner. This is his equation from the laboratory. Discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses that hopefully lead to reinforcing stimuli. Now, somebody plain Englished that some years ago and said it's about antecedents, behavior, and consequences. But Tom Gilbert took it to another step, because what Tom Gilbert recognized was that we're not white cardinal pigeons or hooded rats. That is, individuals are different. And so what he said is we could look at these three columns as reflected in Skinner's equation. And we can say the first one is about information. The second one is about responding or response. And the third one is about motivation. But there's a component in the environment that he called data, and then instruments, and then incentives. And then there's these pieces that the individual needs or brings to the table: knowledge or skills and knowledge, capacity, which is how we select and assign people to jobs or tasks, and then what are their motives. And for Gilbert, this was a way of addressing Skinner's issue, which is that a consequence is not effective unless it is. And so we can arrange incentives, but they may not work. If you don't really care about going to Hawaii on President's Club, maybe we ought to come, that's not your motivation. Maybe we ought to come up with a different consequence. So this was Tom's thing. And I encountered it again in about 82, and I started using it with our colleagues and other, people on my consulting teams. And we just loved it because we were living down in the knowledge box mostly. But what we recognized was, in order to implement programs, in order to be sure that training that, let's say, we were doing with salespeople would actually be applied on the job, we need to engage sales management in the top row. But what we found was, as soon as we started really partnering with sales management or other stakeholders, they were like, what? What do you mean? What's that data thing? Is that like spreadsheets or data? What is that? Or instruments? Is that a violin or an ohm meter or, what is that? And incentives. Okay, I understand incentives, but what about unintended consequences? Like if the process is so bad that people are punished by using it, so they try to avoid it. Well, where do skills go here? What is capacity again? Is that, it's individual capacity. That sounds like an organization, et cetera. So we found that people made a lot of category errors, and we'd sort of try to teach this, and then they come back with all these questions. So I spent about 5 years, like a lot of other people did. I mean, some of our other colleagues tweaked this in different ways. Chevalier did, Stolovich did, other people changed the language a little bit. But I changed it with sort of Steve Jobs' user experience, user testing in mind. And over about a 5 or 6 year period, we tweaked the language until we came up with this language. And it worked. And we could introduce it to people, and they didn't make category errors, and they kind of understood it. And we could use it both as an analysis tool and as a design tool. And it was plain English. And we could even have a report to senior executives that had sections with those headings. And they wouldn't say, what do you mean expectations and feedback? That sounds nerd. They would know what it was about. And so we kind of knew we had it, but I'd still stumble over myself because I honor Tom Gilbert, and I would be presenting to groups of people, and I'd say, well, you can see this is not quite the same as Tom's thing, but it's still different. But and at some point in about 91, I was working at Dun & Bradstreet with the sales group, and the VP of sales training, really smart guy, was in the back room, and he said, you're always talking about those boxes. Why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? I said, okay, so we'll do that. And then eventually we trademarked it, because if you actually go back in the performance improvement literature, you will see Gilbert's thing being called the 6 boxes. You'll see all kinds of weird uses of the language. So we wanted to be sure this is our thing. This is a user-tested thing. And so that's what it is. So that's how we make sense of what influences performance. And we can detail it in great detail about what goes on in each of those cells. But the cells are functionally defined. In other words, anything that sets expectations and or provides effective feedback goes in that cell. Anything that enables people to perform as they're performing, information, enough light, enough time, having people to turn to, having the right software, that all goes in box 2. Box 3, all the things that happen afterwards that may either increase or decrease the likelihood of performance, et cetera. So that's how we answer that question. So then what do we do with it? How do we analyze and improve it? Well, this is where we think, a little bit simpler model. We just paste these 2 things together, and we said, whatever you're doing, if it's coaching an individual or planning for a 3-year project, we always want to start out by knowing what's at stake for the organization. Is this about market share or profit? Oops, I'm sorry. Because that makes a difference. Is this about safety or employee engagement, or what is this about? for the whole organization or the company. Once we know that, we then say, let's take a look at the performance and identify the work outputs and be sure that they do contribute to business results. Because as lean process people will tell you, every once in a while you discover some form or something that's there, it's been there for 20 years, but it's not valuable, so you get rid of it. So we want to be sure that whatever the work outputs are actually do contribute. And then we say, now that we know the work outputs, it's a piece of cake, relatively speaking, to identify the behavior, because we can do task analysis, we can observe successful people, we can identify best practices for producing that output. And if we apply a little bit of what Tom Gilbert called exemplary behavior analysis, we can observe and interview star performers if they're a lot better than average and figure out the tricks that they do that are different from everybody else. Once we do that, now we can measure, because there's really only three things to measure. We can measure business results, which probably is already happening in many cases, kind of lagging indicators. You don't get many data points, but it's important to do. You can measure behavior, not by asking the manager whether you think the behavior changed, but counting it or using a behavioral checklist. And that can be very important in things like safety environments or feedback in customer service or diagnosing why outputs are not happening, but it's relatively expensive. But the highly underutilized thing is if we have countable nouns that are work outputs, we can count those. And so there's a whole measurement framework that fits into that very nicely. Once we do that, we then go to the 6 boxes and we have a little design thinking we throw in there. We say, let's analyze for this behavior to produce those outputs. What's positive, what's missing, what's negative in each of the cells? And then let's brainstorm some possible improvements, because we don't want to jump to the usual conclusions. Oh, well, we'll just do this. No, let's take a look at our best performers. Let's use best practices. Let's think about some possibilities here. And then ideally with our stakeholders, let's choose the configured set of behavior influences that ideally are optimized because they work together, they're aligned, and they're the most cost effective. If we can do it with a job aid instead of training, let's do that. If we can have the supervisors consistently setting expectations and providing a little more frequent feedback, that may be a lot cheaper than some other interventions to develop people, et cetera. And so we do a little agile. We measure and we decide and we change as needed until we get it right. And then for us, because there's only really 21 plain English words in there and 2 pictures, we share this. And what we find over time is that our stakeholders begin to get it and they begin to participate more actively. So that's where this came from. And we've had people in all these kind of roles learn about this stuff and use it. It works. I mean, we've been doing this for 20 years now. So, so shifting into how do we get out of the training box? And I know my bit is going to go a little bit longer than the hour, but I'll try to keep it quick. First thing is, what I always recommend is if we're training professionals, if that's most of what we do, try what can be a subtle shift in how we define our learning objectives. Instead of saying at the end of this program, you're going to be able to do, or you'll know, or you'll understand, say at the end of this training program, you'll be able to produce a budget, a plan, a decision, a better relationship, a strategy, a team that looks like this. In other words, focus from the very beginning your training modules and programs on work outputs, because at least you'll guarantee if you do a decent job of it, that will contribute to a valuable thing. And it will also subtly shift things in a way that your learners might not even notice that much, but to valuable outputs that then are also the things they need to produce on the job. And so that opens up the door for engaging our stakeholders. We definitely need our leaders, managers, and supervisors to help, because at least my definition of leadership and management ultimately is that leaders and managers are responsible for arranging those behavior influences to optimize the productivity and the engagement of their people. And so if we can help them do that, and we do that through a coaching program, there's some other stuff, then we can partner. And so we need them. We can't manage the top row otherwise. We even have derived, and there's a whole bunch of stuff related to this, but this is a set of best practices for leaders and managers that came out of a combination of just our analysis of what leadership and management is, but also out of the Gallup employee engagement data. And I'm just going to move right through this because we could spend an hour on this, but we can think about how to engage our leaders and managers because there's a lot more of them than there are of us. And we have this accomplishment-based coaching program, which I don't want to be shameless commerce here, but we've learned that we developed this program because there's a few of us performance consultants, but there's a lot more leaders and managers, and we can teach them how to have conversations with their people to define their valuable outputs and then have conversations with them around the 6 boxes to help improve. That's a big deal. We can even stand back and look at talent development altogether. Instead of relying on competency models, which I hope I don't upset anybody, but to me, competency models are among the worst thing that ever happened to talent development because they're abstractions. And I don't care how you do it, communication effectiveness, if that's a competency, it looks a heck of a lot different than if I'm selling something versus having a one-to-one conversation with my direct report versus having a tough negotiation with somebody. Those are different hunks of behavior. And so a competency model doesn't help very much from my point of view. But if we define work outputs of a job in the way I just mentioned, we can do hiring and recruiting and onboarding and training and ongoing coaching and decisions about promotions and so forth, all built around accomplishments. And in fact, that there's a webinar down there. Again, if you look at the recording of this, you can get, it's a QR code, it'll take you to that webinar. So here's some suggested tactics. I've got a couple lists here. One of them is try to avoid being geeky. And I'm not going to say any of you do, but I certainly have seen my colleagues go in and talk to people about flipped classroom, this, that, and the other thing. It's like, what? The manager doesn't know what you're talking about. So try to be plain English. Try to speak in, one of the best compliments I ever had, probably 25 years ago, was from a senior vice president of sales. And he looked at me and he said, you're not too bad for a guy with a PhD. And I still think of this as like a high compliment. One of the things that I often do is I take those 2 little models that I showed you, and I'll have an initial meeting with a stakeholder, a client, and they'll tell me their issues, and I'll ask them about their business and what they've tried and all that kind of stuff. And then at some point I'll say, can I use your whiteboard? Or if it's on a screen, can I use a screen? Let me show you a little bit about how we think about performance. And I'll basically go through that logic I showed you and draw the performance chain and talk a little bit about it with examples from their world, and then get to the 6 boxes. And I probably will have heard some stuff there. And they never say, what do you mean? That doesn't make any sense to me. Usually it's like, oh, okay, I can see that. Use work outputs from their world also. Because if we're trying to be accomplishment-based, you can say, those reports you're trying to get up to speed, or those relationships with our vendors, or those whatever it is, that's what we're trying to improve. And let's talk about that. Explain the ROI thing. Because most business people or most stakeholders, they will get it, that if we're just relying on training, I bet you've had complaints from stakeholders where they say, your training is not working. And you say, well, if we could engage your supervisors and managers in setting a little bit more explicit expectations and providing a little more feedback in the beginning, and maybe give them some tools that they can use, we might be able to get a much bigger payoff. So engage them in that conversation about how we got to work together, man, if we're going to make this pay. Another thing you can do that I find useful is a lot of senior executives or senior stakeholders that I've worked with, once I show them the performance chain in the 6 boxes model, they'll say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And then if they play with it for a few weeks or months, they'll say, it helps me take all the stuff I've learned through my career and frame it in a way that's useful. And so I've even had senior people who would normally say, oh, I know all that. Say, oh, this is helpful. It helps me sort stuff out a little bit, and then use simple examples just from the 6 boxes. You could just be a little bit more explicit at the beginning of your meetings about what we're trying to accomplish here. And then you could highlight when people do a good job with it. Really simple stuff, but they'll get that often. Another one that actually Bill Blunt, who's retired now, but he's the guy who brought us into Amgen over a dozen years ago. And Amgen now has over 300 certified performance thinking practitioners worldwide. So he ultimately had a big effect. But in the early days, when he was starting to work with stakeholders and do projects, And they would come to Bill and they'd say, that was great. It really made a difference. We should give you like an award. And he would say, don't talk to me, talk to your peers. Talk to the other guys that, could benefit from this. So try to direct your successful stakeholders to tell other folks who might be interested. So those are some thoughts, and I've got more, but those are some ideas, and hopefully we can talk about those in a few minutes. Again, coming back to this, I think there's two parts to this challenge. One of them, to get out of the training box, is to learn how to do performance improvement. And I think the models I showed you can be a beginning for that. And the second thing is the partnering. So when you do it, become masterful at this, get real fluent with it, and I find that it's easier to do that with our models, but whatever framework you use, get good at it, obviously. But then try to be flexible and friendly and forthcoming and confident and all that. That is, and again, a lot of you folks are from Minnesota, and I always have this feeling like, for example, Minneapolis and Seattle are very similar cultures in many ways. And, and what I mean by that is there's a lot of regular, nice folks in both of these places. And I've watched performance professionals sometimes come in and try to tell stakeholders how it is in a way that is not terribly friendly or flexible. We need to, and you all know this, you're professionals, but I think that's important. Now, the This Just Works part actually came from Amgen, which again is our longest and biggest client. But Gina Rester-Zadro there, that runs their community practice, she just tells her stakeholders, this works. So if we do it, if you let us do it, you'll see it produces results. And so there's a certain confidence without arrogance. I always say be rigorous, but not rigid. And what I mean by that is we define the three elements of performance: business results, work outputs, and behavior fairly specifically. Behavior is an action. You describe it with verbs. Outputs are countable things. You describe it with nouns, and you get rid of the verbs because there aren't any verbs in there. It's a thing, not an action. And business results, we're always looking at the organizational level. We want to look at the success of the whole entity. So there's definitions and criteria like that that we're pretty rigorous about. But within that, there's a lot of flexibility. And so I think this, to use the current framework term, there's a mindset which is both flexible but precise. Get lots of applications. One of the things I've learned is that people who can get real good at improving the performance of a role, like in training or onboarding or coaching, may not be familiar with process work. So in your own professional development, try to do different kinds of projects where you can apply performance improvement so you get some flexibility. And then, of course, build a culture of collaborative, learning. So I think these are things you all know, and I think are not that difficult, frankly. I think it's this one that's the hard one. And again, you all know this probably, but ask lots of questions, show insight, show that they said smart things because they did. Again, use plain English, not jargon. I think the models that we have help people communicate simply what we're doing. I think the HPT model may be just fine for inside talk, but I think if we're talking to our stakeholders, if you show them that, it's like, whoa, that's too much for me. So try to be really simple. And then this is an important one, and I guess I observed this in a few cases where I've come into organizations and had performance professionals that were so pissed off at being rejected or being held in the training box that they kind of copped an attitude, as they say. And what I've observed as an outsider, because I've been an outsider my whole career pretty much, but the most successful people that I know inside of organizations have still been friendly. They said, okay, we can do that. Now, one of Gary Rumler's recommendations was, if your client won't let you go outside the training box, then do as quick and dirty a training intervention as you can and move on. Don't waste time on it. And I thought that, when I heard that, I thought, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's a pretty courageous thing to do, Gary, but it's exactly right. Because if you can only do training, that's fine, do your best, but don't go overboard because it's going to have limited impact. You're looking for the people that will help you partner. And in fact, one of the things that Bill Blunt at Amgen used to say to me, he said, a lot of times I would go in and do an analysis and there'd be other things beside training. And they'd say, just do the training part, Bill, thank you. And then maybe 5 or 6 months later, they'd come back to him and say, you know, some of that stuff you were talking about, I think you might be right about that. Could you come back and work with us? So if you maintain a friendly relationship, the door stays open. Focus on the high ROI thing. We're going to help optimize return on investment by partnering, not just by doing this little point training solution. And then, as I already said, prompt them to talk with their peers. I also think it's important, if people just think we produce training deliverables, I think we need to shift. And so they say, wait a minute, these people have a particular expertise in analyzing performance that we can benefit from and designing interventions. Those are the things that I think we need to be known for if we can. So basically, I just a couple more slides, but then let's just talk about this. Again, we got a ton of stuff at performancethinking.tv, and you can get to those easily. We've also started putting out free study guides for our webinars because we got a lot of them. And so you mentioned the your book group. I've got colleagues in both ISPI chapters and ATD chapters who do book groups, but they've also started watching these videos and talking about them. So that's another way to kind of learn together. And then here's the last few things that I just tagged on at the end. One is, you can rename your function. If you can get the department to be changed from training and development to learning and performance, or performance development, that's a good thing. But you can't just stop there. That doesn't change the world. You need to then advertise your services. You need to say, beside training, we do performance analysis, we can improve processes, we can do implementation planning. In other words, expand the perspective of who your stakeholders think you can do, what you can do. Whenever you find a non-training intervention opportunity, try to partner around that. So this, I don't think anything terribly new there. And there's our open virtual practitioner program. But let's just stop there and see what people might think or have to say. I'm sorry, there's a lot of stuff, but so I'm just looking at the chat box, and I see Susan, I see your response about focus on what people do. I'd like to focus on what people produce. And I often have to shift my language because it's so easy for us to talk about what people do. And we might even be thinking about accomplishments in the back of our heads. But I try to discipline myself to use words like contribute or produce, because that sounds more like a thing. And it's hard to do it. I still slip on that a lot. Anyway.
I might have typed that before you covered that.
That's probably, yeah, I know. I just wanted to.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, if we focus on the outputs, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
I can give some examples from my own experiences working either in full-time or contract roles. I was at Capella University and I was working in their financial aid area, and the department was making quite a few errors, and they came to me and said, we need a training program for these people that process these applications.
Mm-hmm.
Let's spend the time and money developing, a half-day course or something like that. But before I took that training request, let's solve it with training, I said, could I take a look at your job aids? Do you have any information that you're referring to when you code these financial aid requests? And sure enough, one of the gals gave me this tiny little, it was almost like 4-point font thing. And it was really hard to read, and it had been copied 1,000 times. So it was faint. And I'm like, okay, this is probably the problem. This is probably the root cause to why you guys are making coding errors. Can I redesign this to help you fix this issue? And again, kind of having that performance consulting hat on, thinking outside of the training box. Sure enough, I color coded it. I made it larger font. I fixed a few things that were wrong with it. And sure enough, then the errors went way down.
You
So that was a simple solution that fixed a problem, you know, based on outputs of these being miscoded, you know, and didn't have to do a half-day course that may not have solved the issues.
probably cost them a few $100s of your time instead of 10,000 or whatever.
Exactly.
This reminds me, I have to say, of something that Joe Harless used to say. He would say that people, exactly the situation, people would come to him and say, we need training, Joe. And he'd say, well, can I talk to people a little bit? And then he'd come back and he said, and a job aid will solve this. But what he would do is he may have a session where he'd introduce the job aid, and he referred to this as training and drag, which I thought was really funny. In other words, it was really a job aid, but he was sort of making it look to keep the stakeholders happy. Now, I'm not sure if I would recommend that. I think I like what you did better, which is just be very straight ahead and say, we can do this with a job aid. That's a great
Yeah.
example.
Yeah. Another example, I work at Medtronic, and I have for about 20 years now in both contract and full-time roles. And when I was in a full-time role, working with the field force, so all the sales reps and clinical specialists and TFEs, as we call them, we came up, me and upper management came up with this idea of signing people off on their training. We needed to put some teeth into the training to make sure that our field reps were trained
Yep.
before they covered, you know, cases out in the cath labs and the ORs. So it really elevated the importance of training, that they get signed off before they touch, you know, any products and touch any patients or work with any of our physicians. So we we went a step further than that. We actually tied in HR and compensation and said, you're going to get paid, your like commissions and stuff are going to get tied to your training. And that was, again, kind of unheard of, but it's like, you know what, you're not going to get your commission as a sales rep on this product unless you're trained on it. So it really elevated the importance of training, the thorough training, and we used a very you know, a blended approach to the training, both in-house training programs, pre-work, e-learning, online testing, as well as field-based training where they had to be observed in cases before they were actually signed off, and the managers, their district managers, were involved in that effort as well.
That's great.
Um,
Can I respond to a couple of things in the chat, but I wanted to have a thought about what you just described. Did you ever encounter Mager's criterion referenced instruction model?
yes.
Because that's really what I think you just described. You know, what I remember from that, and it kills me because I talked to a lot of our younger colleagues who never heard about it, and I dug out my old set of the materials. But the essentials, the idea was that a lot of times it was in like manufacturing environments, but they had a list of very specific objectives that you had to be able to demonstrate you could do, you know, adjust the machine to the proper spec or whatever it was. And they wouldn't even necessarily always plan formal training. It might be go shadow Jack over there for an hour because you'll figure out how to do it from him, or use a job aid. And they would do exactly what you described, which is you had to come and demonstrate you could perform this thing, whatever it was. And so I always recommend to people that you do that with an accomplishment-based focus. But it's like, why not? Let's demonstrate that people can actually produce the thing, you know. Let's look at the chat box. There's a few things in there. Joe says, what do you see as the role of higher education preparing learners either for a particular role or for working in performance enhancement? Well, two things. One is there are a few programs, and the one I know about that a lot of people know about is at Boise State, where there are some master's programs which really teach performance improvement in a pretty substantial way. So that's one recommendation, which is look at that program. But there's another thing you might find interesting. There's a book that Joe Harless wrote before he died called The Eden Conspiracy. And it's not, just a second, I'm going to put this in the chat box, conspiracy.com. Have I got that spelled right? Yes. And what it was about was making education accomplishment based. And so when he was writing this book, his local educators and business people in Noonan, Georgia, came to him and said, you know, the high schools are not producing people who can work as med techs and people in our local businesses. And so he did a thing with a task force of about 200 people in that whole county. And they developed a program which still exists 26 years later, has been replicated, that takes high school kids as an opt-in thing and enables them to, by the end of high school, have an AA degree and often a certification in things like welding, dental technician, factory automation manager, filmmaker, and the companies, the local companies, have invested in this. So this is not really what you're talking about with higher education, but it's actually building education that's accomplishment based. And if you go to, we reissued that book a few years later because it went on a print. And so I went down and did a kind of review of what that program had turned on into. If you go to EdenConspiracy.com, you can get to it. So there you go, Cindy, a Boise State person. So let's see what else there is. There's, so I don't think I answered your question, Joe, very well, but I think, what do you think about all that?
Well, I think from my point of view, if we go down the route that you've described, higher education becomes much more narrow in terms of a liberal arts or general approach compared to what we used to call trade schools, which are more focused on specific functions.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what the balance is there.
Yeah.
But I think if we seriously do attack performance, improvement, and accomplishment, we're not in the realm of what higher education was designed to do. And so I think there's going to be some redefinitions if we really do follow that.
Well, the only thing I would say about that, it's funny for me to be having this conversation because I went through the Seattle University Honors Program, which was a great books program, and I was a philosophy major. It was the ultimate liberal arts thing. It was wonderful. And I learned to write and speak, and I learned to be a critical thinker. Now, I would argue that as a result of that, I could produce good written essays, good presentations, problems. In other words, I think there were some accomplishments in there that just are not kind of vocational ones in the usual sense. But I would argue that that program did more for me career-wise than almost anything else other than being a debater in high school in my whole history, you know? So I think we can define accomplishments that are in the realm of liberal arts and the humanities as well. But the question is, higher education is so expensive now that I think even if we didn't talk about this, people are saying, wait a minute, I got to spend $300,000 to get a college degree, so it better get me a job, you know? So yep. I think it's a bigger issue, but it's a very interesting one. I agree.
We diverge. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you just, so I'm not sure, Julie, the work functions or roles for performance use. So Julie, I'm not sure if you're still here, but I'm not sure what you meant.
Yeah, what I was looking for, Carl, you had put up a slide towards the end, but it listed a bunch of functional areas of work.
Oh, where people had done this kind of stuff?
Exactly.
Yeah, let's see if I can find that. Let's just a second. Why can't my view? I don't want full screen. Okay, I'll just back up. There? Is that what you were talking about?
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, that's just a random thing, but those are just some of the people that have been through our various programs and have used this stuff in different ways. So I'm looking at Kenny saying, one question, curious about the discussion of ROI equation maximizing. I think so. So Kenny is asking the question about the ROI equation being a division problem rather than a subtraction problem. And I'm with you. I used to think it was a subtraction problem. And then I looked at how people looked at return on investments, and often they described it as a ratio. They often describe it as, well, it's worth 3 times as much as it costs. I think you can do either way, frankly. I'm not sure. when I started looking at ROI, I saw a lot of people who did it as an equation, and certainly, and I'd have to go back and look at Tom's work now and see if in his book he had it as subtraction or division. I'm not sure, to be honest. So we should probably both go back and check that. I don't have a compelling argument about it being a division problem, other than it's easy to talk in ratios sometimes. That paid off 1.5 times more than it, than it cost. But I think you could probably go either way with it. I'm not sure though. Ratios, yeah, there we go. Okay, Joe, there you go. In business sense, ratios are operating language. I think that's probably where that came from. I'm fairly certain. Anything else? We've got 8 minutes, Susan or anybody. I hope this was useful to people. I just looking at the pictures of people that are here, I think we have a lot of pretty mature professionals. So probably many of the things that I said were pretty obvious. I think though, and of course I'm always pitching our thing because I've devoted the last 20 years of my life to try to simplify this so we can get outside the boundaries of those of us who love talking about it. And I really have found, we had a funny experience at one big pharmaceutical company where a vice president in charge of performance improvement, actually, well, he was in operations, though he was not in charge of training and such, but he learned about this and he was calling it the 6 blocks for a while. And my inside my client there said, it's okay, he gets it, he'll learn about it. Now he says 6 boxes, but it was like, okay, an approximation to the plain English will do for now, anyway.
Dr. Binder, I've even used your 6 boxes approach at one client where we had them sort out different things, write stuff on Post-it notes and then sort it out into the 6 boxes. And, then they could differentiate, oh yeah, this is the training box, but we need to address the tool issues first. We don't have a tool to do what we need to do to accomplish what we need to accomplish. That's what we need to solve, so again, thinking outside the training box. There's other factors going on here that, training will not solve.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's kind of, yes, Sandy, yes, the National ISPI conferences, yes, you're right. 2 things that I just mentioned or noticed Sandy saying. Yes, the conference in Virginia this year, I think ISPI has finally hit bottom and is going back up. The team of people, Nancy Burns and the crew who've been working on this for a few years, they paid down the $250,000 debt to 0 now. They're in the black. It's a vigorous bunch of people wanting to do good stuff. And so I was so happy because that organization served me so well. So go to the ISPI conference, do presentations, share your work. But getting back to what you said, Susan, I know we've got just 4 minutes or 5 minutes, but a couple things. One is you probably also know the Peter Dean exercise that we do, where you say, if you could, to a group of people, I like to do this with managers, if you could pick one thing that would make the biggest difference in your personal performance, what would it be? And don't overthink it, just list it. And they list it. And then you sort it into the 6 boxes. And what you learn is that most of it is in the top row. If expectations were just clear and consistent, if they just give me some feedback, they'd get rid of this crappy software and improve it, if whatever it was, And so it's like you say, well, you're always thinking training is the solution, huh? But for you, I guess it's this other stuff, and that can be illuminating for people.
Exactly.
Any
other final questions or comments for Dr. Binder? This has been excellent. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, Susan. I have one other comment to make.
Yeah.
Which is that we sort of came up with the 6 boxes in whatever it was, the late 80s, early 90s. And I started talking at ISPI, among other places, about it for a long time. So people learned about this. In fact, in 2022 ISPI conference, a fellow organized a session about the best performance model in the world. And guess what? The 6 boxes won. I think it's because it's practical and useful, but the thing that I've learned is the 6 boxes is a very nice model, and you can do a sort of a half-baked version of applying it and probably be better off than if you didn't have it. But the hard part of this work is defining the accomplishments. And so what I always encourage people to do is, until we've defined the performance rather precisely, the 6 boxes model is not nearly as powerful as it could be aimed specifically at the performance. So I always point out that, okay, I'm glad you like the 6 boxes, but please get better at defining the work outputs or accomplishments of people, because then we'll get to the specific behavior needed, and then the 6 boxes applied. So I just want to put that pitch in, because everybody loves the 6 boxes, which I do too, but it's the other part that's hard, you know. So.
Yeah, a little bit of analysis can go a long way.
Absolutely. Yes, as Joe Harless said, a pound of objectives is worth it. No, ounce of analysis worth a pound of objectives. Anyway, thank you. I appreciate this. It's fun talking to people. So.